Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm excited because we're going to be talking about teaching, which, as you know, I'm very, very interested in.
Is that teaching as in, let's say, with regard to yoga teaching, or is it teaching anything?
I think it's quite a universal concept because, as you know, as a doctor, we actually part of our role is being educator. So we're not only there just to provide clinical care, look after people who are sick or unwell or want to get better health. Actually, part of our role within our profession is to educate, not only to our patients about the concept of health, illness, how to, strike a balance, but also to our colleagues within like the team or medical students. That's a
Okay.
lot of things.
So teaching is very much linked to the evolution of society, isn't it? Because if you think about it, what you've got in one way is that actually society evolves because we bring up a quality or a level of education within our society that then becomes a foundation that we can then build forward from. And that forms part of the evolution of society. So
Hmm.
actually, teaching is fundamental. It's not that we're sort of teaching from scratch. Is that actually what we're doing is that more like kind of coral is we're kind of building very slowly one bit on another so that actually, we can evolve forwards and we can become a better society. So teaching really is a sort of a fundamental root of that. So it's providing or passing on some wisdom and some knowledge that actually helps society go in a good direction.
Absolutely. And then the interesting thing is then how to teach also become a topic of being taught as well. So pedagogy, which is like a method of practice on teaching, especially like an academic subject or theoretical concept,
Yeah.
is a whole thing now because you can go to do a course in medical educations or education in general, you can do it as a postgraduate certificate, a diploma or master. So it does back to the question,
Mm.
can we really teach how to teach, or is it something that we have to learn on the job? Because you do a lot of yoga teacher training or yoga therapist training as
Yeah.
well. So that's a concept, but actually we have to train people how to teach.
But there's training people how to teach, which is interesting because it means that what we're starting to do is we're starting to look at creating a number of foundations because we want someone in order to teach someone needs to know their subject matter, don't they?
Yep.
I mean that becomes really important. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that people have is that is I remember, I mean, it's, how much do we know about a particular subject matter?
Hmm.
Do you see what I mean? Because the more we know we don't know. And then
Yep.
that causes an issue because actually what I found quite often was with the people that do teacher trainings or therapist trainings, particularly therapist trainings, which is kind of like post-teacher training. You do this kind of therapist training, and suddenly what happens is your eyes become open to this vast world that you actually didn't know existed, and you suddenly freeze. You suddenly,
Hmm.
hang on a second, I don't know enough to teach. Do you
Yeah.
remember those concepts when you see that in the room with people?
Oh, I remember that very well myself, actually. But that's quite interesting also as a concept because actually to know something is almost the foundation of
hmm
being able to teach.
Right.
Because it's based on a lot of like taxonomy or pedagogy theories. Like
Yep.
Miller is one of the people that actually knowing something is actually at the bottom, at the base. But actually, that's not the most essential part. Actually, you need to keep building upward. It's then to know how the know-how. So almost like the interpretation and application of it.
So this idea of because also what you're describing here is something quite interesting, is that we've got one aspect which is where we know something, and sometimes we can show off with the sort of things that we know. We can sort of like, hey, look what I know. I know absolutely everything. So
Love doing that.
you you do that. No, you. So you almost look to impress people with the amount of stuff that you actually know, and not get the level right. I mean, there's a whole series of stuff that you're talking about here that we can break out as part of this.
Hmm.
But you're looking at how, because you're looking at knowledge and also technique. And the technique is kind of interesting because there has to be an experience which actually combines with that technique, which is often different from what we read in books or the theory of something. So
Hmm.
there's a sort of almost a line within knowledge where we've got this aspect of experience, but also this aspect of a reference which we look at with regard to, where do things come from? So if we look at something like yoga, quite often the references that people use nowadays are modern texts, which are actually slightly different from the ancient texts, which I find very, very hilarious when you look at this. And then also experience is that we can have our own individual experience, but we can make someone else feel that their experience isn't a valid experience as well. So actually what happens is that we end up distorting the teaching as part of the process. So within the knowledge of the subject matter, I think that actually there's got to be a skilled delivery in their demonstration. There has to be an understanding of an experience. There has to be the capacity to deliver the what you're teaching to someone else so that they actually get the experience of it and they actually discover it for themselves, and that discovery is validated by, let's say, and maybe just being able to reference it from a text.
Hmm.
And when you start to look at it in this way, what I've seen within yoga is that actually every experience that we have can be referenced to, 2,500 or 2,000-year-old text, and not you don't have to make anything up. And you don't
Hmm.
have to leave the subject area as well. You don't have to go off to another subject area. Actually, it's all there, but we have to know where to find it.
I love how you just kind of outlined everything because in the teaching, what we can break it down to is having the teacher,
Yeah.
having the student or the person
Mhm.
who's, receiving the teaching. That's the subject matter, which
Right.
can be based on text or most of the things that actually can come to be related to the text.
Mm.
That's also a setting where's the learning and the teaching happening, isn't it? Like, is it in a home? Is it in a classroom? Is it in a real life scenario? Is it in a simulation? And I think also in a modern way of looking at teaching, that's also the concept of assessment as well. It's like how do you kind of achieve the competency or show that you have the competency of doing things. So I think that it's got a very interesting few areas, and maybe we can just go through each and every single one of them in different ways because I think there are probably a lot of similarity in how the West come to learn about it and how it was illustrated in the East text as well, or in the philosophy.
Mm.
Well, for a teacher, what does it mean? Because in order to have for teaching to happen, there needs to be a teacher, isn't there? Is it a facilitator? Is it a role model? Is it someone who just provide the information or develop the resources? Someone that plan or someone that assess? Like what's the role of teacher in yoga?
Well, you've asked a very interesting question here because when we start to look at this from two texts in particular, one is you've got an Upanishad which looks at this, and you've also got a text called the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which actually gives a number of different ideas around this as well. And the key thing, one of the things we just talked about, is exactly this: is this idea of knowledge, someone that who knows. And knowing is kind of interesting because you're looking at what we know and what we don't know. So there's an honesty in what we actually know. And that honesty becomes very important because we know what we don't know. And then we're very clear about how we actually share it. And we've also got the experience. So this is called Jnani. It's someone who actually knows, someone who actually knows and also shares. And the sharing aspect becomes important because there's a particular way of sharing. Um, and it means that the person that knows actually has the experience, which means that they can answer lots and lots of questions. Because whenever you are looking to teach someone, particularly in yoga, is that rather than it being this is the way it's done and this is how it's done, which is almost a sort of one-way approach of doing it, there is a kind of like the ability to give lots of different approaches within the same field. And that becomes very important as well with regard to the ability of someone that knows, because it means that there become huge numbers of variables. So rather than saying, your legs have to be, your feet have to be together, the edges of the things have to be here, the hand has to be here, the foot has to be here. It's more not just this idea of adapting to an individual, it's basically seeing a person as a person and understanding how that person can evolve based on their capacity to experience what you're asking them to do and what they're learning to do as well. So it's not just about instruction, it's really about how does that person take on board what you're given? Because I think there's a difference between teaching and instruction. And I think
Hmm.
you can instruct someone to do something, but how do you teach someone, which means that actually they can do it themselves?
So again, it comes back to the difference between knowing and know-how, isn't it?
Yeah.
And also the next two level, which is in Bloom's kind of pyramid, is showing and also does. So it's actually demonstrating for the person to demonstrate what they have learned, and
Hmm.
also just to perform in the real life scenario is not just like a demonstration or simulation, actually be able to do something, the competency
Mm.
that come through.
Mm.
I love you said that actually in the text, it was in one of the Upanishad, I think, where actually the teacher is deaf, isn't it? I think that was a text where the teacher is a deaf and kind of talking to the protagonist in the story and actually going through several topics. I love that because kind of like you said, instead of a very scary concept, if I see or view death as an endpoint, actually
Mm.
someone at the endpoint has the capacity to actually give so much, isn't it? Because
Mm.
there's a lot of experience, there's lots of memories, and there's a lot of things that they can impart as a knowledge to the person who's learning. And I think that will be one of the, kind of prerequisite for teacher in the Western sense as well.
But so there becomes a difference here because we've got access to huge amounts of information right now.
Mm.
Okay, and this information is different to knowledge and experience, isn't it?
Hmm.
Because in a way, I can just basically, watch, let's say, yoga on YouTube, or I can follow this, or I can learn that, or I can read a book, or I can do this. Why do I actually need a teacher?
Hmm.
I've got access to absolutely everything. So actually I can teach it myself. I can teach myself from this source. So why do I need a teacher?
Hmm. So is it the individualized rather than standardized teaching that we can receive when you have a actual teacher in front of you or with you?
I think one of the most interesting things for me is our perception and our pattern of interpretation based on what we're presented with and what we actually read. How we actually misunderstand or how we don't get the level of nuance and depth that actually occurs through an interaction with another human being to pass on some wisdom and knowledge.
Hmm.
To read a book, I get a certain thing. But what I'm doing is within that reading of the book is that there's this kind of ancient idea that almost that the person that authors a book or writes the book, as they put this book together, and me being an author is gone through this painstaking process, is that how do I put something together that is in a format that someone else can understand? Because words are condensed with regard to their meaning and feeling around the thing that I'm trying to portray. And the person that's reading it is looking to unravel that meaning and feeling based on what that means to them. But they're missing me, which can translate that to a way that it can mean and feel something to them.
Hmm. So there's a
So
kind of
it's
difference between the
fine.
instruction and teaching again, because the instruction is more on the words, whilst teaching is actually can be a lot beyond the words.
Mm,
Hmm. But that's also very interesting because actually the format of teaching has changed a lot, at least in England or in the West that I have observed or I can find in kind of like historical context.
mm,
Pre-Victorian is much more, as you said, like one-to-one, isn't it? It's much more tutor, especially for people who can afford it.
mm,
Then come to Victorian time where actually everything is slightly more standardized because of the Industrial Revolution. Like you have people, philosopher or educator like Dewey then kind of form these concepts. Actually, we need to organize it. We need to standardize it. We need to create a school where actually everyone can be in a group together and learn the same thing. And it's great because it clearly is kind of creates a very, very efficient process of teaching and learning in some way. But in the other way, we also now kind of craving more and more to be individualized again.
So we're against that area, which is that actually we want to fit in. We want to have a standard with regard to the processes that we come to do. But yet within that, we have to then take into account the individualization. And I think we're moving more back towards individualization within our education because we're actually making much more considerations to different people's abilities um, within our educational system. For instance, when we run a course, what we do is we ask people that, is there anything, we need to understand with regard to learning from the outset? And if there are different learning abilities, what we do is we tend to put in place um, different processes which allow that person to navigate and for us to measure their evolution as part of an educational process effectively, but that they can be compared with other people, even though they're using the same methodology, so we can achieve our goals, which is that we've educated them to a particular level.
Hmm.
They become a teacher.
Yeah,
So
themselves.
it means that for me that there's a huge amount of preparation within the background and a huge amount of capacity to almost adapt.
Hmm.
That sort of that preparation is gives a good sense of balance and proportion based on the group that you're working with. If what happens is that we are lazy or let's say a bit sort of haphazard in the way that we're doing something. So, when we deliver a course, what we tend to do is we tend to deliver it in steps that almost in a way each step appears to not be linked, but then suddenly it comes together. So
Yeah.
there's a methodology, a healthy methodology in place with regard to delivering something. Um, but there's also the capacity to adapt. And what I think a healthy course or a healthy teaching or any healthy teacher does is they adapt immediately based on what they see. And also they start to look at the detail, the level of detail involved in the overall process, and they sort of are a bit flexible within those details as well. And I see this as being sort of quite important with regard to the preparation aspect and working with regard to teaching.
And I think I understand this quite well because, as you said, right now we're preparing for a course that is about to happen in the future. And actually, I'm learning a lot from this process where, kind of like in therapy, you said, actually, a lot of the time, there's no rules. And I
Mm.
find that is so important because the more preparation I do is so that I can be more and more flexible and adaptable when I'm teaching. Because if
Yeah.
I have a fixed format, which used to be the case, because actually the subject matter is very well defined, especially in
Yeah.
medical teaching, I do like I remain on the course. But actually, if I want to be more and more clinical, or in the sense that, I want to impart knowledge that is from the real life examples, it's not just text, not just things that people can Google or, find on the internet or through artificial
Mm.
intelligence. I have to be more and more adaptable. So actually everything comes more easily and actually understandable.
Do you remember some of the modules that we prepared? For these courses, right? You and I, we prepare these modules and we would kind of like have 50 slides, and
100, I think.
preparation. I know. You'd have all these slides and then you go on and and remember this is for a day or a weekend,
Yeah.
and you'd be doing a specific subject matter, which was, very complicated. And you do this preparation and you'd have all of it ready. Then you go into the room and you'd work with people and you'd only cover like 10 slides.
Yeah.
Those 10 slides were the most amazing slides of absolutely everything. And you were able to impart so much knowledge to people based on those 10. But the actual preparation of those 100 in the
Yeah.
background, no one ever saw. And no one sees that actual preparation. But what they do see is they see your capacity to adapt,
Yeah.
your capacity to be flexible within that, and the capacity to listen and hear, and to be able to deliver and answer the questions that are needed rather than to push or to rush.
Hmm.
And I think this is the other thing within teaching is about time. Is that if what we do is, and I've got this real thing, is that the more pressure we exert, the less capacity we have.
Hmm.
And I think that within teaching is how do we take pressure off people who are learning so that actually what they do is they actually have more
Hmm. I think we see that in the West style of teaching as well. Because if I think back into my primary school, it's very, very
Mm.
regimented, like classroom, confined space, then and population density or student density is quite high. Moving to secondary school, you split into different subjects. one teacher to slightly less students and come to the university or, postgraduate training, actually become less and less and actually more and more self-led. But actually, the amount of pressure is still there because I remember all the way through, I always have a lot of tests and exam, and there's always kind of a hand somewhere just like pressing. It's like, oh
Mm.
my God, I need to keep moving forward. And then not pressing to actually pushing forward is probably more the direction that I felt. It's like, I need to keep going, keep going, keep going. That
Mm.
was the feeling.
But within this is that I think is the importance is also to inspire. So I think that effective
Mm,
teaching inspires people, you know, because
mm,
actually if you've got a sort of a, if you've got an enthusiasm, if what you're doing is you're looking to inspire, you know, people become interested in the subject that you're actually working with. And I
mm,
think that I think it's there's, you know, on one side, I was speaking to someone earlier today who they retired from teaching because they they said I was in a situation in a room where I couldn't actually adapt and give what I needed to the people in front of me. And I
mm.
realized I was being quite critical to those people. So I needed to step back from what I was doing.
That's
And
so good.
that was really, really, really good. And they said that was 12 years ago. And they said, I feel I'm ready to come back to it now because something had changed, because there was a particular outlook. And that outlook meant that the way that they were and the methodology and how they were imparting the information didn't inspire other people. In fact, it caused an issue, but they realized it was causing an issue. And I found
Mm.
that very interesting, because I think this is all part of it with what we're doing.
But isn't that something to do with how we are being assessed as well? Because I'm looking at the material I have right in front of me right now, where Bloom taxonomy, it goes from kind of the foundation level again, remembering something to understanding something, to apply something, to analyze, to evaluate, and then last bit is to be able to create.
Mm.
And I know we use that word quite a lot while we're designing the course now, isn't it? Like actually how to be creative. Because actually having the ability to create something is very inspiring, not only for the people that we're interacting with, but also for ourselves. Actually gave us a lot of freedom. And the more we try to, push towards the direction of remembering something, understanding something, that almost the more dense it feels.
Well, I feel that you're right. I'm passionate about creativity. Well, I personally believe that, and I feel that creativity is addictive.
Mm,
And
in a good way.
in a good, yeah, but it's a positive way. There is something that comes from this, which means that the more I put structures in place and say that I have to follow these procedures and structures, the less creative I become. The more
Mm,
I have to follow this. And we see this quite a lot. We see this with regard to something being very regimented. You know, you have favorites in a class. You have, you know, it's structured in this way. It's all, you know, we keep things in this order. But the other side of it is that we have a structure.
mm,
And the structure becomes very important because the structure becomes the roadmap for us.
yes.
The route that we take should be different every time. And because it's different every time, we remain alive. And we're
Mm,
looking to take a different route, because actually, when I'm coming to deliver something to someone, when I'm coming to give an idea about something, if what happens is I personally take the same route all the time, it's like I've got a script and there's no depth to me whatsoever. I'm just like, you know, this, and this.
oh, I remember those moments.
Well, do you know
Not
what I
from you,
mean?
not from you.
Yeah, no, for me, thank you. No, but do you know what I mean? There's this kind of this kind of script aspect, but actually, what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to take a different route, not just for that person, but also for me.
Hmm. I think that's very important as well, actually, because what you said is there needs to be a structure, there needs to be a foundation, because like how I describe and just recited the taxonomy, actually
Mm.
every single step is very important. Otherwise, if we're just being creative on its own right, it becomes like a floating triangle in the middle of space where actually it's not based on anything.
Yeah.
So it needs to base on something that you understand and remember in the past and has applied, analyzed, and evaluated. So those are all very important.
Right.
But
So
I
you need
felt
the
like,
structure.
yeah, exactly. But I
You
felt like
need
the
the structure.
goal is to be creative, isn't it? It's not to actually remember loads and loads of facts.
No, it's not. Do
But
you
also
remember?
that is easiest to assess, or at least as an assessor myself, sometimes that's the easiest thing to mark, maybe. What's marking someone's creativity sometimes quite hard.
Yep. But we also get caught up in those different things, which is kind of interesting. Do you remember having to learn every origin and insertion of muscle?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah. Then how often, how many clients do you think you've seen? I've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I've also trained a lot of people as well.
Hmm.
How often have I used the origins and insertions of all the things I've learned?
Yeah.
You as a medical doctor, the same thing. How many people have come in and just kind of well, I think it's the insertion point just over here. This, you're like, no one, absolutely no one.
Or which neuroreceptor does the drug actually interact with in order to create the effects? It's like no one cares. No one asks.
But this is very interesting. It's important to know how something works.
Hmm.
Really important to know how it works. But how the emphasis that we put on the importance of things as well, I think becomes huge, especially when we're looking at teaching. And if the emphasis on yoga teaching and you're using yoga as a therapy is very interesting because what you're doing is you're looking at how is that person a person? What what am I asking that person or showing that person to do so
Hmm.
that becomes unique for that person so they put that into themselves and create an experience for themselves which actually helps them. And to be able to do that means that I need to train and teach someone about the variabilities of a human being. I also need to train them with regard to the variabilities of the effects of the different things that we put into ourselves to create different effects.
Hmm.
And it quite often means that for most people is that putting something into someone else, like a posture or a breathing technique, actually is there to change what is going on within that person. And so there's a whole sort of stuff that we need to unravel with regard to how a person is.
And also that's a big area on how you observe the person as well. Because actually, as you said, while you creating this change, how you're observing all of this
Mm,
and at what level you're feeding back as well. Because that's a big part of teaching as well, isn't it? Like, how do you feedback if the other person's doing well, not doing well?
mm.
What does it mean when they're doing well? What does it mean when they're not doing well? Or do you go back to the default, pardon my language, the typical shit sandwich? Have you ever heard of that? Where you give good feedback, bad feedback, or critical feedback, and then good feedback again.
So really what we're saying is that there needs to be a purpose within all of this knowledge as well.
Absolutely.
And I think the purpose becomes very important because if we can put together purpose, we can be very clear in the direction that we're going in. And we can also keep the points interesting as part of it.
Hmm.
Otherwise, what happens is that almost in a way, things don't fit together, they don't make sense. And we need to go almost somewhere else to say, hang on a minute, this doesn't make sense, it doesn't fit together. It's to this, it's to that. How does it operate in the world? I mean, quite often things are okay in theory, but in
Hmm.
reality, they're very different. And I think the purpose of doing everything needs to be very, very clear. What's the purpose of doing something?
It needs to be practical.
And we need to answer that question within the purpose. And for me, every aspect of teaching, every aspect has to have purpose. So we have to use the wisdom, have to use the knowledge that we have, the experience that we have, and to set things up in the right way so that actually someone else gains that wisdom and that knowledge, and then they can go off on their own and do amazing things with it.
Hmm. And I think that's partly why I always love it when you teach the Yoga Sutra Patanjali as well, because which is also the top subject of the books that you authored. Because
Mm.
actually you taught it in a sense that is always very, very practical, isn't it? It has to be relatable in real life. It's not just text, not just philosophy, not just theories. It has to be relatable. It has to
But
work.
this was the key way that I learned. You know, we had this situation where every single we did all the texts from the Sanskrit. So
Yeah,
we had to learn to chant them first of all. And I was the worst chanter in the world ever.
I'm sure you're not.
No. I was so bad. Anyone that remembers me from about 35 years ago would turn around and go, you know what? I can't believe he couldn't say a word. He was the worst ever.
Oh,
But but the interesting thing is that it's we started in that way. We'd have to learn what it meant. We have to learn what it meant in Sanskrit, but there's a difference between this sort of direct translation, word for word translation, which almost appears sort of separate from our own world. So
hmm.
how do we take this translation, which appears separate from our own world, because almost we can live two lives. We can live the life of a person in society, and then we can kind of on the side go, well, as a yogi, I believe in non-violence. You know, there's these two lives, but actually, how do I integrate these lives together?
Yeah,
This for me is one of the most important things with regard to teaching is how do we integrate these things so they don't become separate. They actually naturally form part of ourselves. So we don't become odd or weird. We actually have a better relationship
centric.
within, yeah, it's within society. We don't become fanatical. We're just actually, you know what? We're a pleasure to be around,
Yeah. Well, and
maybe.
also in some sense, it's also you always have been.
Oh, stop it.
Well, and also like you said, actually, then it showcased that we know how to do things as well, isn't it? It's not just we're living in a separate world, but actually we know how to take the knowledge back
Right.
and live in the real world.
And the other thing, because how we were taught that quite often people hide behind esoteric words.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is that you use a word and you'll make an assumption that everyone understands either what that word means or it's some sort of, you know, barrier word or it's a word that kind of
Mm.
like almost we can't really grasp.
Like a facade.
Yeah. And the question is what does that word really mean? And quite often these things are very accessible to everyone. So how do we translate these things so that someone else can relate to them and access the wisdom and the knowledge that's within that for themselves?
Yeah, and I remember a lot of my science teacher back in like secondary school and things like that. The best ones are usually the one who tells the best stories, like the
Mm,
ones that explain concentration in the context of like cosmetic products or food or whatever it may be, is to actually explain what does it mean to have a really concentrated thing or really diluted thing. And actually, then I even now like 20, hopefully not quite 30 years yet, but 20 years on, I still remember them.
mm.
That was a good teaching in my eyes.
Right. But that for me is inspirational teaching. It's how do we deliver these things so that it inspires other people so that they can get their heads around it. It forms part of them. And they go, yes, I get that. And they don't have to repeat it, but they ingest it, digest it, and then they're able to then deliver something, the same thing in a very different way to someone else.
Hmm. Yeah. So a student, someone who can be inspired, who actually then get the knowledge, but also have the
Mm,
understanding and also hopefully have the ability to showcase what they have known and what they've applied and evaluated. What
mm,
does the teacher get out of the process? What, is it just salary? Like, why do people want to teach? Or what's the role of a teacher from that
mm.
sense, especially in yoga? I'm interested.
Well, from this is a very interesting question, actually, because it's a question that I sort of put up quite a lot with regard to, when you're interviewing someone, you say, well, why is it that you want to do this? So
Hmm.
for me, I want to keep my tradition alive. So I've been given all these teachings in all these different ways. And with these teachings, and our training wasn't sort of like 200 hours, it was kind of 11 years.
Yeah.
And, and even then, there was more and more and more on top of that. And, how do you give a piece of paper for thousands and thousands of hours of this type of thing?
Hmm.
And nowadays, you kind of So my question is, why is it you want to learn these things? What's the reason behind people wanting to do these things? And so I then start to ask sort of numbers of different questions. What is it that someone has, or what is it that they're lacking? What is it that teaching can bring to them? Is there something within them that is a natural teacher? Because there is something within people that is it part of their role in life to actually do this?
Hmm.
And I think that we need to understand what our purpose is in life, and sometimes a to hold the tradition and then pass that on may be one role in life, but for someone else it may be to specifically care for people in another field.
Yeah.
So it could be we have to understand what is our role, what's the kind of direction that we go in, what's the specialism that we come to do within this. Is it that actually we're going to teach and inspire large groups of people? Or is it that actually we're looking to care for individual people suffering at their end of their life? Is it that we're going to help people to leave this world? Is it that we're going to help people to birth in this world? So I kind of question all of this, what the potential is within someone, but also why people are drawn to and why people want to do this thing. Because in essence, what we're doing is that we're using it as a way to help other people
Hmm.
and not as a way to help ourselves per se,
Hmm.
even though we evolve ourselves as part of it, because there's a lot of self-evolution.
I like that concept because that kind of related to how we started today as well, isn't it? It's actually teaching is how our society and community and our almost the species of human evolution come from. Everyone learns something in our lifetime, and actually passing that on allows the next person to build on top of that, which we are all benefiting from, like, these subjects of, I don't know, mathematics, English, chemistry, physics, biology, yoga. These are all different things that people learn and studied and dissected and really, really hone in over time. Actually, we get to benefit. I almost feel like to have the ability to pass it on, it's almost quite innate because we all learn, don't we? Like at home, we learn from our parents or from
Mm.
our family or siblings. We learn in school, we learn in real life. And
And
very often I hear actually most teachers that I met, they said they learn a lot from their students.
correct. But we learn a lot from imitation as well.
That is true.
Okay, and one of the key ways of learning is by imitating, which is why actually in specific fields we need to look to people that actually, let's say in the yoga field, someone who actually is practicing and
Hmm.
actually has, is practicing and is also stable as well within this.
Hmm.
So there becomes this idea of firstly role models, which is that you have someone that as a teacher has particular qualities, but also within this is that actually you feel can help to support you and evolve you, but without there being an imbalance in the way that a relationship is.
Hmm.
Because this becomes an important dynamic within this, and teaching has an important dynamic because traditionally it was the head of a student on the feet of a teacher.
Hmm.
So what happened is there was this kind of connectivity. It's called guru parampara. It's there was this connectivity between teacher and a student,
Hmm.
and this area traditionally was one where there was a lot of trust and there was a lot of individualized communication. But I feel that now what we're getting to is we're getting to a stage where this sort of special sort of area is now being sort of done in groups. So that
Hmm.
what's happening rather than it being a sort of a one-on-one area, it's almost like a one to many, but it's also got to again be careful on the dynamic between the one to many as well. So the
Hmm.
dynamic is a healthy dynamic still.
Hmm. Because we have seen cases where it's unhealthy in many,
Correct.
many different fields.
And I think this is an important thing to look at because within teaching it has the dynamic and the boundary has to be a healthy one,
Hmm.
which means there
Well,
needs to be accountability.
of
And
course.
there also needs to be observation of that interaction as well, which I think becomes important.
and there's a professionalism, there's a standard to be upheld
Correct.
towards. And maybe also there's a shift as well, kind of like how the Western kind of traditional educational system is shifting from like a one-to-one more into organized one, just to make it more efficient. I can
Mm,
see actually this organization of yoga teaching or yoga therapy teaching in an organized way is good because it actually streamlines everything. But
mm,
at the same time, there's also a shift later on. Actually, we are more craving one-to-one contact again, where it's individualized
mm,
teaching, which I think is very important because everyone has to have their own journey in some way.
correct. And I think again, we find this more and more and more is that what we find that this idea of fitting in, forming part of something, belonging, coming together, having a shared link with
Hmm.
each other, but also the capacity to be very much our own individuals and confident as being our own individuals. So that confidence, that conviction, that trust as being an individual, I think is a very important part of coming out of being a teacher.
In a very, very crude analogy, it's like all of us want to be the delicious cookie dough, but none of us want to be the cookie cutting standardized shape. Sorry, clearly you can tell that I like cookies.
You love cookies.
I do.
I think within teaching, there's also got to be a generosity.
Hmm.
I think giving is a very important thing because giving and being open to give, but also understanding how what you are giving is going to be received.
Hmm. Like the reaction that other people have when you are being giving and generous.
Yes. And to ensure that you give in the right way to the right person. Because
Sounds
I think
interesting.
that there's something within this is that sometimes, and you've seen a lot of group dynamics with regard to teaching and education, and how actually, in one way, how does one have patience and tolerance and give wholeheartedly when, there's various different dynamics within a group?
I was gonna say, if you told me this 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't quite understand because in my head would be you need to give 100%, you need to give 200%, you need to give
Mm.
wholeheartedly. But actually, I'm coming more and more to appreciate, yes, there's a right level of giving and there's a right level of taking. Giving too much sometimes causes a lot of problem as well.
And so for me, this is within teaching, this all forms part of it. It's understanding, again, we're back to capacity. We're also sort of at capacities, potentials. So there's a real sort of sense of feeling
Hmm.
in a room when you're teaching.
Yeah. So just giving enough to kind of inspire and usher the person along or the people, the group along, but not to overwhelm and drown them and burn them.
Mm.
Nice.
The other thing I discovered quite a lot of is I remember when I first started teaching yoga, I was very fanatical. Um,
Hmm.
and I wanted everyone to do it. I wanted everyone to discover it. Every single person. I was like, my goodness, you got to try that. Oh my goodness, you got to try that. I was like every single person. And now quite often, so earlier today, I was speaking to someone at a sort of a tea event, and they were having a hip replacement.
Hmm.
They've been through loads and loads of hip replacements. I just sat there sipping tea and asked them a few questions and didn't get involved. They kept very quiet.
Hmm.
And I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about all of these things, which
Hmm.
is when to get involved and when not to get involved, when to keep very quiet about something, and when to, if so, unless someone asks for help.
Hmm.
And for me, this is a very important aspect of teaching because it means that, and Diskachar, who inspires me a lot, I always used to remember what he said is that you, only if someone asks, do you teach it?
Hmm.
So the key question is that they would say when you went there, what is it that you would like to learn?
Hmm. It's almost like the primary role of a student is to ask questions.
Is to know, but the student will say, "Well, I don't know what I want. You tell me what I want." And
We hear that a
actually,
lot.
you see what I mean? You hear that a lot. This is another thing. The idea of being a student is something else because, but actually, to as a teacher, is that to listen to what it is. What is it that someone wants? And
Hmm.
teaching someone what they want becomes crucial. Rather than teaching what you think they should have or what this should be, actually teaching them what they want.
But it's on the curriculum. How can I not teach them? But I think you're right. It's sometimes you need to teach them a little bit of something so that they have an idea what can be learned.
Mm,
But then do need to wait for the question because otherwise, I've done it plenty of times where I actually gave things that people didn't ask for and create a whole lot of problem for myself.
yeah. So actually there's an aspect of natural self-control within that process.
Hmm.
Um, within the behavior and within the action. And how to be involved in certain things and how not to be involved in certain things, and also how to keep quiet and just communicate from a place of reflection and I think that's a kind of like an important thing. But also, how do we deal with other people? Because teaching is dealing with other people, isn't it?
Hmm. Huge
And
amount.
and I remember, you and I discussed the concept of boundary, as in
Yep.
not being a wall, but as in being a point of contact between two different places.
Yep.
And almost in a way, you've got this contact in between two different places when we're actually working with someone. And so, how do we really understand that place? And how can we touch and care, but also not care and be compassionate in the right way and have a good, healthy attitude within the interaction with someone else?
But not be too involved or overly involved.
Correct. So for me, there's a whole series of stuff that is around sort of morals and integrity and honesty and sincerity within this process, but also to ensure that what's happening is that on one side, I'm doing the best that I can do based on my observation of the other side.
Hmm. One last question for you. As someone who is so experienced, I know you have 25 years plus of experience of teaching and training people. Do you think teaching get easier or has it actually got more complex or has it just evolved over time?
My feeling is that there's been a change with regard to the requirements that are needed from someone that is teaching this subject matter, which is yoga as a therapy or yoga currently.
Hmm.
There's been a sort of general shift in with regard to what's acceptable and almost sort of what was what was quite special maybe 25, 30 years ago
Hmm.
is now sort of almost common knowledge.
Hmm.
So how do we take things that are special and use those to lift and evolve people?
Yeah. And to inspire.
Mm.
Hmm. Thank
Hey,
you.
good to speak to you.
You too. See you next time.
You will do.